Now in a moment here, I'm going to go over the tools and equipment needed to complete this cleaning job, but before we get into that, locate your emergency shutoff switch. You should already be familiar with where this is located. In my case, it's right next to my unit. It has a nice red switch cover, so you can't miss it. In your case, it may not have this red cover, but oftentimes these are also found on the stairways leading down into your basement or cellar. But shut the unit off and let it sit for probably 3 or 4 hours, so that way when we go inside, everything's cool to the touch. While we're talking about safety, ensure that you have a carbon monoxide detector on every floor of your house, and make sure you have smoke detectors. Check your local fire codes, but carbon monoxide is a odorless, tasteless gas, and it can kill you, and if your equipment is not adjusted properly, could emit carbon monoxide and kill you. So please ensure that you have working carbon monoxide detectors and test them regularly. Alright, now let's go over the tools and equipment needed to complete this job. So you're going to need some rubber or nitrile gloves. In my case, I'm going to be replacing the gasket where the burner meets the boiler itself. I purchased 2 brushes specific to my boiler. I searched online for the make and model of my boiler and then added brushes, and I found these 2 corresponding brushes. They are specific to this unit. Make sure you find specific brushes for your boiler. You don't want to just start shoving any size brush down in your unit. We're going to need a variety of hand tools, channel locks, flathead screwdriver, open box wrenches. Have my impact driver here with a couple different tips. Also have a small piece of, this is small engine fuel supply line. We're going to need this to check oil flow a little bit later on. Replacement inline filter. I'd recommend you buy a few of these because they're introducing this biodiesel nonsense now, and that stuff has a tendency to gel up. So definitely keep quite a few of these on hand. In fact, I actually have a tin can with spare boiler parts in here, so I have a couple extra nozzles and filters, and I'm going to keep that right by my unit. But when we're talking about nozzles, you're going to need a replacement nozzle. Also, you're going to need some brake parts cleaner, paper towels, bucket, low profile catch pan, and you're also going to need a steel drum vacuum with a HEPA filter hopefully, but just a vacuum in which you can vacuum out this unit. There may be some hot embers inside this unit, especially if you don't allow it to cool down, so it's important that you have a steel drum vacuum. That way, you know, plastic vacuum would catch on fire otherwise. So fire resistant vacuum for sure. Now let's get started. Alright, so we're going to start by checking the water supply side of this unit. So basically the water comes in from the well back here. We have a pressure reducing valve, which we're going to check that screen here in a moment. But we also have the expansion tank. So as this unit heats up the water molecules expand, and that expanded water needs a place to go. And that's where the expansion tank comes in. That allows that expanded water to go somewhere. Now, we can check to see if the expansion tank is generally good by tapping on it. If I tap towards the bottom, where there should be no water, there's kind of like a diaphragm in here, which goes up and down. But if I tap on the bottom, it should sound somewhat hollow, and it should sound somewhat more solid as I go up. See, that sounds hollow, and as I go up, it sounds solid, which tells me that there's water in the top of the expansion tank, so I suspect that the expansion tank is good. Now, a common sign of a bad expansion tank is water coming out of your pressure relief valve. So if you have water dripping out of your pressure relief valve, you may have a bad pressure relief valve, but most likely you probably have a bad expansion tank. Alright, so here's the water supply line for the boiler. Now, this water supply line brings water to this point at 45 to 65 psi, which is way too high of a pressure for this boiler. This boiler only calls for 15 to 20 psi. Check your manufacturer's recommendations, or specifications rather. That's where this reducing valve comes in. So this reducing valve drops that high pressure down to 15 or 20 psi or somewhere in the middle. This is adjustable, but this is properly adjusted for the boiler right now. Now, I replaced this last year because my boiler wasn't getting enough water, and I don't think I actually had to replace it. What was actually wrong was there's a little screen underneath here, and it was just clogged up with schmutz. So we're going to unscrew this screen and ensure that it's clear momentarily here. What we need to do first is isolate this reducing valve, and we're going to do that by shutting off this valve, which is on the well water supply line, and this valve right here, which is on the boiler side of the valve. So now that I have this section of pipe isolated, we can go ahead and take our channel locks and carefully remove this screen or strainer. Alright, I'm going to take my channel locks, spin this. I have a little catch pan underneath here as well. going to be a little bit of water that comes out of here. There's our filter. Filter, there's a little bit of schmutz on there. Not too bad. I'll show you here. As you can see, there's a little bit of crud on that screen. Not too bad, but this is something you definitely want to check once a year, especially if you don't have a whole house water filter. So let me go clean this off. I have that screen all nice and clean. I'm going to reinsert this back up into the reducing valve. Here's the cap. It's plastic. I'm not a huge fan that it's plastic, but there's an O-ring in there. Just check to ensure that that's in good condition. It is. I'm going to thread this back on. I'm going to call that good. After you're finished cleaning out that screen on that regulator, don't forget to open up your two water valves, supply side and the boiler side. Turn this counterclockwise. Alright, the next thing I'm going to do is take off this elbow and we're going to check this horizontal chimney pipe. I want to ensure that the pipe is clear, not obstructed, and it makes sense to clear this out now because if any crud is knocked back down into this vertical chimney stack, then we can get it when we clean and vacuum out the unit. So we're going to work our way from the top down. After we complete this task, then we're going to go down and we're going to start taking the unit apart, and we'll get to brushing eventually. Here's a look inside the chimney. Definitely dirty, could use a good brush at some point, but main thing is that it's not obstructed. There's a little bit of loose debris on the bottom of that horizontal pipe, so I'm going to vacuum that out with my shop vac, and then I'll reassemble things. At this point, I'm going to remove the top cover of the boiler, which I have a fastener here and a fastener here. And just be careful when you remove this cover. There should be some insulation underneath this panel. We're trying not to damage that. And also, this panel is received into a little lip right here, so you may have to work it one way and then work it the other way. You know, just be careful around the pipes. Looks like it can also get in here with a flathead screwdriver and not necessarily pry, but I can twist this a little bit. We are again being very careful with the insulation underneath this cover. I can lift this up. For my boiler, I also have to remove this metal plate. Alright, so once you remove that metal plate, you should have access to what I'm calling the heat exchanger. I'm sure there's probably a more proper name for it, but that's basically what all these finger-like structures are. So there's, I believe, cast iron pieces in between these fingers, and inside those cast iron cavities is water. So basically what happens, that oil fire burns down below, and that heat and exhaust rises up through the fingers and exchanges that heat energy to the water inside the hollow tubes inside the cast iron. So the cleaner we get these heat exchanging fingers, the better the energy transfer should be. That's how it should work anyway. So basically, as the heat and smoke rises up through these fingers, it gets expelled out the chimney pipe here. So for cleaning these fingers, I mean, I don't think there's really much to it. As long as you have the appropriately sized cleaning brush, all you do is pretty much slide this down in the channels of these heat exchanging fingers. And I like to go in little strokes just to make sure the brush doesn't get stuck, but you go down a little bit and just go all the way down the channel and come back up and then go to the next one down. I really think it's just pretty self-explanatory here. Nothing special. Spend as much time on this as you want because it's your unit and nobody's going to treat it like you do. Go down on this side a little bit too. A little bit tighter on this side. Just got to be careful not to get the brush stuck. I know I need to go down a little bit further, but the camera's in the way. But, I mean, you guys get the idea. Just clean these fingers out the best you can. Now, if you look down in there in between those fingers, there's actually a solid buildup preventing any heat from coming up through these fingers. Now, there's a very specific tool for that. I don't have that. I have a thin piece of metal. So I'm just going to come down in here carefully and try and clear the obstruction that way. You can see it right there, maybe. Just going to poke it through. Sorry, hard to get good camera view, but you can see I'm starting to clear it. There's a little bit more over here. Work it back and forth. It's like a built-up of crud. See how that's clear now? I'm going to do it a little bit better off camera, but I just wanted to show you that. That's something you may run across because, truthfully, it's going to be impossible for you to really get all these fingers. So, you know, do the best you can. Alright, so I have the heat exchanger brushed out to the best of my ability. What I'm going to do now is just take the shop vac and just vacuum out any loose crud in here. Also pay very close attention to this elbow right here. Try and vacuum that out. If you can't vacuum it out and there's crud on the bottom, simply remove the bottom and make sure you clear out any loose crud in there. Make sure there's no obstructions in the bottom of that pipe. But let me vacuum this out now. From the top side, of course we need to get down to the bottom at some point. So off camera, I actually did pop this elbow out to clear it out. And it's probably a good thing I did because I also identified that my boiler is missing the screw that prevents this elbow from backing off from the cast iron heat transfer plates. So just went through what I had in the shop and I found this little fastener and I think this will do the job just fine. Yeah, that'll ensure that this pipe stays in place. So now we're good to reinstall the metal plate on top of the boiler. Now I'm going to reinstall the top panel. Pay attention because you want to make sure that the panel, there's a lip on the panel, that's received into this edge on the front of the boiler. I'm going to put my mask on because fiberglass. Going to reinstall the two small fasteners. Sharp point screws, to be specific, hold this top cover in place. Alright, now we're ready to start servicing the oil supply side of this heating system. So the first thing I need to do is shut off the oil flow going to the filter and the burner itself. So there's this twist style valve, so I'm going to twist this to the right all the way. I'm going to push it down to ensure that that valve is fully closed off. Now that I know that the oil flow is shut off at this valve, I can take my 5/8 inch socket wrench. I can start loosening up this bolt. Also note that I have my low profile catch pan laid out as well as some paper towels. Now's a good time to have some gloves on because this is going to make a little bit of a mess. Alright, so the inside of this oil filter looks pretty darn clean, but I'm going to take some brake parts cleaner and just spray it out into this bucket here anyway. And it was actually dirtier than I thought. You could see some of that black crud coming out of there. That looks a lot cleaner. Put that on our paper towel. We get our new oil filter. First things first, there's a new gasket. I'm going to go ahead and seat that on the metal part of the canister. So we have a new gasket there. And we also have a new filter. Also included in the kit should be two smaller O-rings. So one of these smaller O-rings, the medium-sized O-ring, is going to be for this tightening bolt. So there's a little O-ring on top of the housing here. I'm going to try and Get this out of here for you folks. Oh, it's actually on the bolt. My bad. So there is the O-ring that was on this tightening bolt. So we're going to replace that. It's actually more of a gasket. I shouldn't even call it an O-ring. So that's replaced. And there's also a little bleeder screw right here. And the kit included a new O-ring for that bleeder screw, so we're going to go ahead and replace that as well. So the bleeder screw is 5/16. You can loosen that up. Remove the old O-ring. Put this new tiny O-ring on the bleeder screw. Tighten up the bleeder screw. Okay, now we can put the new filter in the cartridge. Make sure that it's seated in there. Reinstall it. Alright, the filter's on there good and tight. Boom. At this point I'm going to turn the oil flow back on, so I'm going to twist this shutoff valve to the left, counterclockwise. Now that I have that valve open, I'm going to take my, what is this, 5/16 wrench, and I'm going to crack the bleeder screw open. So I have that bleeder screw open. I can hear a little bit of air coming out through it. So the oil is being gravity fed into the filter now, and we're just going to wait for oil to start coming out of that bleeder screw. Alright, see some oil coming out, so I'm going to go ahead and shut that off now. Tighten it back down. Now I'm going to take my brake parts cleaner and just spray this off to remove any oil residue left on the filter housing. Alright, now that we have that fuel filter changed, what we need to do now is we need to check our oil flow at the fuel pump here. So the oil supplies this, I'm going to call it a high pressure fuel pump. I don't think it really goes that high. Built it up to maybe 100, 150 psi. I believe this is adjustable as well, something of that nature. But there's a little test port right here, so I'm going to connect my clear tube to this test port, hopefully. It's nice to have a clear tube as well, that way you can see what kind of oil flow you're getting. But I also have a 3/8 box wrench, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to flip the burner switch on, and I'm going to crack this and just check to see that we have good oil flow to this point, because I believe in this high pressure fuel pump there's also a secondary filter in here. So if we're not getting good oil flow here, it probably means that we have either a failing high pressure fuel pump, or we have a bad or clogged, dirty filter in that pump. So let me turn the emergency switch on. And this also helps to bleed out the air. So the unit's on. I'm going to crack this. We're getting really good oil flow. I'm going to shut this off and kill that emergency off switch, because we still need to vacuum out the unit. But I just wanted to test our oil flow, and we're getting good oil flow. Alright, so we have good oil flow coming through our fuel filter, through our high pressure fuel pump, and then the fuel goes through this jet tube to this device right here. If anybody knows what this is in the comment section, please inform me. I believe it's a fuel shutoff solenoid. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that's what it is. And the fuel goes through this final jet tube, and then it goes into the burner unit itself through the nozzle and into the combustion chamber. Alright, so looking at the left side of the burner here, if you look at these numbers, I believe this is for an oxygen adjustment. So if a professional technician does a combustion test and determines that the unit needs more or less oxygen, he or she would adjust the oxygen by moving this forward or backwards, rotationally, of course. Now, we're not going to mess with that. I'm going to assume that the technician that professionally adjusted this last time set it to the proper specification, so we're going to leave that alone. Now, if you look over here, the jet tube, this is where the high pressure fuel enters into kind of the combustion chamber area, which we will get in there in a moment here, but we are going to need to remove this jet tube. Now, there is this silver plate, and this is adjustable. I believe that controls how far the nozzle sits in the combustion chamber, in or out. Now, I don't believe we will need to play with that at all, but something I always like to do anyway, I like to take a Sharpie and outline where this silver plate sits on the burner, just in case. That way, if it does get knocked or moved, we can always set it back to where it was prior. So I have some paper towels beneath this jet tube. I believe this is going to take, what size is this going to take? So we're going to need a 7/16 inch box wrench, and we're going to crack this jet tube loose. A little bit of fuel will likely come out. Probably should have the paper towels up here, actually. How's that? That's a little bit better, right? So we're going to crack this jet tube open. And these jet tubes do go bad from time to time, so it's not a bad idea to have an extra jet tube on hand. Spin this off. Need to pull it away slightly. It's out of the way a little bit. No fuel really came out. Then there's also a lock nut right here. I'm going to take a pair of channel locks, crack this lock nut loose by spinning it counterclockwise. I actually cracked it loose off camera. So now we will loosen up this nut. And put that off to the side for now. Now what you're going to need to do is go in between the transformer and the boiler itself, ensuring that you have your emergency shutoff switch off, because at this point things can get dangerous if you have live power going to the unit. But simply loosen up this flathead screw, slide the tab like that. Same thing on the left side, loosen up that flathead screw, slide those tabs forward, and now we should be able to lift open our transformer. Alright, so I have the transformer folded over. So you have your two contacts. They make contact with the electrodes. I'll show you that in a moment here. But the main thing I want to point out is this. This is the flame sensor. This detects whether there is in fact a flame in the combustion chamber or not. Very, very, very important safety piece of equipment right here, because if this is operating properly and it detects that there is no flame in the combustion chamber, it will shut off oil flow to the unit. If you did not have this and it did not shut off oil flow to the unit, this thing will literally dump a full holding tank of oil right into the combustion chamber, flood out your basement, and then you're in the hole for thousands, tens of thousands of dollars, especially if you don't have tank insurance. Good idea to consider tank insurance, but very important safety piece right there. So you just want to ensure that that's nice and clean. I'm going to wipe it gently with a paper towel, but it looks very clean and it appears to be in good condition. Alright, so now that we have our jet tube and holding nut disconnected from our electrodes, we should be able to take the electrodes, move it to the right slightly, and pull it straight out like so. So, a couple things. For one, we have our two electrodes, and there are insulators here. And I know the proper thing to do is to loosen up this nut and clean these insulators on your electrodes. I'm just going to take some brake parts cleaner and clean it the best I can the way it is. Because the danger is, if you do remove these electrodes, you have to properly adjust them in conjunction with where the oil nozzle tip is. All right, so here's your tip right here. There is a special set tool for that specific job. I don't have it. I'm not going to mess around with it. All I'm going to do today is just clean this up with brake parts cleaner and replace the nozzle. All right, now I'm going to replace this nozzle. I'm going to take a 3/4 inch wrench, attach it here, and this nozzle is 5/8. Yeah, it's 5/8. Oh, wow. This old nozzle should tell us what size it is. It's a 1.25 80B. And the new nozzle I got should be the same size, 1.25 80B. Looking at the screen on the old nozzle. Looks extremely clean, but can't take any chances. Rather play it safe than sorry. Confirm that this is the right size, 1.25 80B. Thread this in here. We'll get the brake parts cleaner in here. Clean this off. Check for any cracks on the insulators for the electrodes. I don't see any cracks. Get that plate all shiny. Just trying to get this as clean as possible, you know. I'm going to call that good and clean. Time to reinstall this. Also, I should mention another thing that you want to check is that the ends of your electrodes, there's a nice little tip on there. If it doesn't come to a point, either grind a point on these or just replace them. Serviceman charged $200 to replace these electrodes last year just because they didn't have the point on there. I looked it up online. I think this part runs for where these, you know, new electrodes are probably like 15 or 20 bucks. So. And inside the chamber here, where the nozzle goes through the burner, there could be a little bit of carbon buildup in there, so you can take a screwdriver and just shake it around a little bit, knock off a little bit of that carbon. Do a quick inspection in here, spin the fan. Listen for any bad bearings, anything like that. Fan appears to be in pretty good condition. Now I'm going to reinstall our electrodes and new nozzle assembly very carefully. And I'm also just going to reassemble everything in the opposite order. So while this is open, I'm just going to reinstall this holding nut. Tighten down that nut with channel locks a little bit. Reinstall our jet tube. Snug, and we can close her back up. Tighten down these two tabs. Alright, so the final thing we need to do is we need to find a way to get our vacuum inside here to vacuum out the combustion chamber because we brushed it out and all that crud is on the bottom down there. I also purchased a new gasket for in between the burner here and this big cast iron heat plate, whatever you want to call it. So what I've done, I built up a little wooden base for this burner to sit on once I remove it from this cast iron heat plate. So what I'm going to do now is just loosen up these bolts, give it a little twist, and try and pull it right out. Alright, so I was able to get these bolts out of here. It took a little bit of working them back and forth in some penetrating oil. It's up to you whether you want to take them off or not. I know some boilers actually have hinges right here, so you don't really even have to take the burner out of that little hole right there. I mean, truthfully, the best thing to do would be to remove this big cast iron piece off. That way I'd have better access in there to the liner. But basically what I need to do now, let me try and get you some better light. But there's a lot of schmutz in there now from us brushing out the unit. Hopefully you can see a little bit of that in there. But all I'm going to do is stick the vacuum in this hole here. I'm just going to vacuum out as much of that debris in there as possible. Being very careful, of course, not to ruin the liner because there's like a fireproof liner in there, but I think it's also kind of soft, so you want to be careful. You know, just try and suck the stuff on the top and don't suck up the liner. So we're in pretty good shape here. Now I also have my new gasket I'm going to put on. Alright, she's all put back together. I'm going to go ahead and fire her up now. Alright, and she's firing up good. Everything sounds healthy. I'm looking for any oil leaks. I don't see any leaks. We have a little inspection port right in here. We can crack this open. Maybe. Flame looks clean. Alright, unit's running really well right now. Something that you do want to check is the draft. I'm not the best person to explain this to you or instruct you how to properly adjust the draft on your unit. All I know is that we do have a draft control valve right here. And when I put my hand here, I do feel air being sucked in through this draft control lever right here. It's really important that this is adjusted properly. I'm going to do more research, but this is just something that you want to pay attention to. And again, make sure you have a CO detector down here as well. Good water pressure and the temperature is building. No leaks on the floor. Everything looks good. And a final tip I have is after you replace that oil nozzle, take the cap that the oil nozzle came in and put it on top of the bolt that holds your fuel filter cartridge together. That way, when you need to check what size oil tip you have it right there.